"Your mother asked me to find you," the waitress told the billionaire. Some sentences do not interrupt a day. They quietly divide a life into before and after. The lunch crowd moved with the familiar rhythm of polished silverware, low conversations, and the soft glow of afternoon sunlight spilling through the tall windows of Hawthorne Grill in downtown Boston. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the sidewalk as businessmen hurried past with coffee cups in hand, too busy to notice the small moments happening around them. Inside, Claire Donovan balanced a tray against her hip with the effortless grace that came from nearly 2 decades of serving strangers. At 39, she had learned that people revealed themselves most honestly not when they spoke, but in the pauses between words. The elderly couple who still reached for each other's hands before ordering. The exhausted father quietly giving the larger dessert to his daughter while insisting he wasn't hungry. The lonely widow who came every Thursday simply to hear another human voice ask how she was doing. Claire noticed these things because life had taught her that the smallest kindness often carried the greatest weight. When the hostess whispered that Ethan Brooks had arrived, several employees exchanged discreet glances. His face appeared on magazine covers more often than on television interviews. Founder of one of America's largest transportation companies. A man whose calendar was said to be planned 18 months in advance. Yet when he walked through the door, there was nothing triumphant about him. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, his silver watch caught the light, but his eyes seemed fixed on someplace far beyond the dining room. He sat alone by the window without looking up from the folder he carried, as though even lunch had become another appointment to survive. Claire filled a glass with water before approaching his table. She stopped just long enough to steady her breathing. Then she placed the glass beside his hand and quietly said, "Your mother asked me to find you." The words settled between them with surprising gentleness. Ethan's fingers froze around the edge of the folder. He looked up slowly, searching her face with the cautious disbelief of someone hearing a familiar melody after years of silence. "I'm sorry," he said almost automatically. "Do we know each other?" Claire shook her head. "No, sir." She offered nothing more, not because she wished to create mystery, but because some messages deserved room to breathe before they were explained. Around them, plates continued to clink and conversations flowed without interruption. Yet the table by the window felt strangely untouched by time. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment. No board meeting had unsettled him this way. No negotiation had ever reached so quietly beneath the armor he had spent years constructing. Somewhere inside him, beneath the schedules, achievements, and carefully managed distance, a memory stirred of homemade apple pie cooling on a kitchen counter and a woman waiting beside a porch light long after sunset. Claire noticed the faint tremor in the hand resting beside the untouched water glass. She did not comment on it. Instead, she waited with the same patient silence she had once wished someone would offer her own father before it had become too late. She wondered whether kindness could still reach a heart that had spent so many years protecting itself, while Ethan found himself wondering something far less comfortable. If his mother had truly been looking for him, how many quiet Sundays had she spent hoping he would come home before asking a stranger to help her find her son? Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and carefully placed a worn cream-colored envelope beside the untouched glass of water. The paper had softened along the edges from being opened and closed more than once, though never by the man whose name appeared across the front in careful handwriting. Ethan Brooks stared at the envelope without touching it. He recognized his mother's handwriting before he recognized the feeling rising inside his chest. It had been years since he had seen those gentle loops and steady letters. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm. Someone laughed near the front window. A coffee cup met its saucer with a soft tap. Fresh bread arrived at a nearby table. Life, indifferent to private heartbreak, kept moving. Claire folded her hands in front of her. She had promised herself she would never pressure him. Kindness offered freely should never become another burden. "She came in last Tuesday," Claire finally said. "She ordered coffee. Just black coffee. She stayed almost 2 hours." Ethan lowered his eyes to the envelope. "She was here." Claire nodded. She watched people coming and going. She smiled every time the front door opened. Ethan swallowed quietly. His expensive watch reflected the afternoon light as his hand drifted toward the envelope before stopping a few inches away, almost as if touching it might make the years impossible to ignore. Claire remembered the elderly woman well. Her winter coat had been neatly brushed despite its age. Her hands trembled only when she spoke about her son. Not from anger, not even from sadness, only from hope that had grown tired without disappearing. "She never blamed you," Claire said softly. "She only asked whether I believed people could lose their way without losing their heart." Ethan looked up for the first time since the envelope appeared. There was no accusation in Claire's eyes, only quiet honesty. It unsettled him more than criticism ever could. He had spent years defending himself against judgment. He had forgotten what it felt like to stand before simple compassion. Finally, he picked up the envelope with both hands. He did not open it. Not yet. His thumb rested lightly against the paper, as though he feared even that small movement might disturb whatever his mother had placed inside. Claire noticed the hesitation and understood it immediately. Sometimes opening a letter required more courage than signing a billion-dollar contract. She knew because she still kept the last birthday card her father had written before illness stole his steady handwriting. There were days she could not bear to unfold it, afraid the ink would remind her how quickly ordinary moments became priceless memories. Ethan released a slow breath he had not realized he was holding. "Why did she trust you?" he asked quietly. Claire glanced toward the window where crimson leaves drifted across the sidewalk. "Because I listened," she answered. "Some people come here hungry for lunch. Others come here hungry to be remembered." Ethan lowered his gaze once more to the envelope resting between his hands. For the first time in many years, the weight he felt was not the responsibility of leading a company. It was the quiet weight of being someone's son, and he could not help wondering how many ordinary afternoons his mother had spent waiting beside a cooling cup of coffee, believing that hope was still worth pouring one more time. The envelope remained unopened between Ethan's hands long after the lunch rush had begun to fade. He traced the familiar handwriting with the tip of his thumb, as though every careful curve of ink carried a memory he had spent years trying not to revisit. Claire quietly refilled his glass without asking whether he wanted more water. Some questions were better answered by presence than by words. The fresh pitcher caught the afternoon light, and for a brief moment Ethan noticed something he had not noticed in years. The restaurant smelled faintly of cinnamon, warm bread, and freshly brewed coffee. It reminded him of Sunday afternoons in the white farmhouse where his mother would bake apple pie while an old radio played softly in the kitchen. Success had given him private jets, oceanfront properties, and boardrooms overlooking city skylines, yet somehow none of those places had ever smelled like home. He slowly opened the envelope. Inside rested a single folded letter and an old photograph with slightly faded corners. The picture showed a much younger Ethan standing beside his mother on the front porch. He could not have been more than 12. His arm rested awkwardly around her shoulders, and both of them were laughing at something outside the frame. He stared at the photograph for several long seconds before setting it gently on the table beside the untouched coffee cup Claire had quietly placed there only minutes earlier. The coffee was still steaming, just as another cup had done in front of his mother only a week before. The simple object now carried a different weight. It no longer represented a drink. It represented someone waiting. Ethan unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting remained steady from beginning to end. "My dear Ethan, if you are reading this, then a very kind woman kept a promise she never owed me. I hope you thanked her before you thanked me. I know your life is busy because I remember the little boy who always believed he could fix every broken thing he found. I never wanted your success to cost you your peace. I only wanted to see your smile again before we both forgot how easy it used to come." There was no mention of disappointment, no reminder of missed birthdays, no complaint about empty holidays, only gentle affection flowing across the page with remarkable grace. Ethan lowered the letter into his lap as his expensive watch quietly marked another passing minute. For the first time in years, time no longer felt like something to manage. It felt like something that could quietly disappear. Claire watched from several feet away while serving another table. She deliberately gave him space. She understood that grief often arrived disguised as gratitude. It did not always ask permission before settling into a person's heart. When she returned with the receipt for his untouched lunch, Ethan looked at it without reaching for his wallet. Numbers suddenly seemed smaller than they had that morning. He glanced toward Claire with eyes that no longer carried the distance of a billionaire accustomed to solving every problem with decisions and deadlines. They carried something quieter, something uncertain. "Did she seem lonely?" he asked almost in a whisper. Claire looked toward the empty chair across from him before answering. "She spoke about you as though you had only been gone a week." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. He realized that somewhere between building an empire and protecting himself from regret, he had mistaken silence for strength. Yet one question remained heavier than the letter resting in his hands. If his mother had never stopped believing he would come home, what kind of love had been waiting for him all those ordinary Sundays while he convinced himself there would always be another one? Claire quietly folded the receipt and left it beside the untouched coffee cup before stepping away to serve another family near the fireplace. She understood that some moments should never be interrupted, even by kindness. Ethan remained alone at the window, the old photograph resting beside his mother's letter as afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the table. The picture no longer felt like a reminder of childhood. It felt like evidence that there had once been a version of himself who knew exactly where home was. His phone vibrated against the polished wood. 3 missed calls from his chief executive assistant. 2 messages marked urgent. A reminder about a board meeting in Chicago scheduled for that evening. For years, those alerts would have demanded an immediate response. Today they sounded strangely distant, like traffic beyond a closed window. He silenced the phone without reading another message. The movement surprised even him. Claire noticed only one thing as she glanced toward his table. The expensive watch still rested on his wrist, faithfully measuring every passing second. Yet for the first time the man wearing it no longer seemed to be racing against it. She smiled almost imperceptibly before returning to refill another customer's coffee. A few minutes later, Ethan carefully placed the photograph back inside the envelope but kept the letter in his hands. He stood and walked toward the front counter where Claire was wrapping a slice of apple pie for an elderly widower who came every Friday afternoon. The old man thanked her with quiet sincerity, tucked the small white box beneath his arm, and left wearing a weathered winter coat despite the mild October air. Ethan watched Claire wave to him as though saying goodbye to an old friend instead of a customer. "You know everyone here," Ethan said softly after the front door closed. Claire looked through the window until the elderly man disappeared around the corner. "Not everyone," she answered. "Just the people who keep coming back because they miss someone." Ethan lowered his eyes. The words settled more deeply than she intended. "My mother used to bake apple pie every Sunday," he admitted after a long silence. "I cannot remember the last time I tasted one with her." Claire gently placed the remaining pie box on the counter. "She told me that," she replied. She laughed and said she always made one anyway because hope deserves a place at the table, even when the chair stays empty. Ethan looked toward the pie as though it belonged to another lifetime. The simple dessert had become another quiet anchor, carrying years of patient love that had never asked for repayment. He reached into his wallet not for money, but for a business card. He held it for a moment, then slowly placed it back. Offering influence suddenly felt like the wrong language. "Did she ask you to convince me to come home?" he asked. Claire shook her head. "No. She only asked me to find you. The rest," she said with a gentle smile, "she believed your own heart would have to decide." Ethan looked once more at the family letter resting against the warm coffee cup. For the first time in many years, he realized that success had taught him how to build destinations for millions of strangers, yet he had quietly forgotten the road leading back to the one front porch where someone still believed he would walk through the door before the pie grew cold. The bell above the front door chimed softly as another customer stepped inside, but Ethan did not look up. His attention remained fixed on the family letter resting beside the faded photograph, while the coffee in front of him had grown warm instead of hot. Time had quietly changed everything on the table without asking permission. Claire gathered a few empty plates from a nearby booth before returning with a fresh pot. She paused beside him. "May I?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. She poured fresh coffee into the same cup, never replacing it. Somehow that small choice mattered. It reminded him that some things were not meant to be discarded simply because they had grown cold. He watched the dark coffee settle before speaking. "I spent years believing I was building something my mother would be proud of." Claire rested the coffee pot on the counter. "I think she already was." Ethan gave a faint, almost puzzled smile. "How could you possibly know that?" Claire looked toward the front window where the October sunlight reflected against passing cars. "Because proud parents usually talk about who their children are before they talk about what their children own." The words landed quietly. No judgment, only truth. Ethan lowered his eyes again. The expensive watch on his wrist suddenly felt heavier than usual. Every award ceremony, every acquisition, every headline had been measured by that watch. Yet none of those hours had found room for a Sunday afternoon at his mother's kitchen table. Claire reached beneath the counter and carefully unfolded the receipt from the elderly widow's lunch earlier that afternoon. The woman had left a handwritten note across the bottom instead of a large tip. It simply read, "Thank you for remembering that today was my husband's birthday." Claire smiled as she tucked the receipt into a small wooden box she kept beneath the register. Ethan noticed. "You save those?" he asked. "Only the ones that remind me people need to feel seen," Claire answered. "Money pays the bills. Kindness helps people keep going." Ethan looked from the receipt to the family letter in his own hands. Suddenly they seemed strangely alike. Neither was valuable because of paper or ink. Both carried proof that someone had chosen to care. He carefully folded his mother's letter along its original crease before slipping it back into the envelope with the old photograph. This time he held the envelope against his chest for just a brief moment before lowering it again. It was the smallest gesture, one no one else in the restaurant noticed. Claire did. She quietly looked away, giving the moment the privacy it deserved. After a long silence, Ethan finally stood. He reached for his wallet, then hesitated before placing several bills beneath the receipt. The amount was generous, but it was not what mattered. "Thank you," he said. "Not for finding me." His voice softened. "For reminding me that someone never stopped waiting." Claire nodded, accepting neither praise nor credit. "Sometimes," she said, "love keeps the porch light on much longer than we think." Ethan slipped the envelope beneath his arm and walked toward the door. His assistant called again as his phone vibrated inside his jacket, but he silenced it without looking at the screen. Standing on the sidewalk, he turned toward the highway leading out of Boston, then glanced in the opposite direction, where an older state road stretched quietly toward the small town he had not visited in almost 8 years. For the first time, he found himself wondering whether the longest journey in a person's life was not measured in miles at all, but in the courage it took to finally drive toward someone who had never stopped believing they would come home. The engine started with its familiar quiet confidence, but Ethan did not turn toward the interstate leading to the airport. Instead, he rested both hands on the steering wheel and watched a single brown leaf drift across the windshield before the wind carried it away. The navigation system continued suggesting the fastest route to Chicago. He reached forward and switched it off. The silence inside the car felt unfamiliar at first, then strangely comforting. He placed the family letter on the passenger seat beside the old photograph, careful not to crease either one. They no longer felt like pieces of paper. They had become traveling companions, gently guiding him toward a place he had spent years avoiding. Nearly an hour later, the skyline of Boston disappeared behind him, replaced by quiet roads lined with maple trees dressed in shades of gold and crimson. Every few miles, another memory surfaced without warning. A roadside diner where his mother had once insisted they stop for pancakes after a little league game. A weathered white church where she had volunteered every Thanksgiving. A small hardware store where she had let him choose his first toolbox because she believed every young man should learn how to repair things with his own hands. He smiled faintly. Somewhere along the way he had learned how to repair companies but forgotten how to repair relationships. His phone rang again. This time it was Daniel, the chairman of his board. Ethan looked at the screen until it stopped ringing. Seconds later, a message appeared asking whether everything was all right. He typed only 6 words before setting the phone aside. "I am going to see my mother." It was the shortest message he had written in years, yet somehow it felt like the most honest. Hundreds of miles behind him, Claire finished her afternoon shift. She untied her apron slowly before opening the small wooden box beneath the register. Inside rested the widow's receipt, a child's hand-drawn thank you card, a faded photograph of her parents, and now another memory she would never write down. She wondered whether Ethan had already turned toward the old state road. She hoped he had, not because she expected gratitude, but because she believed every family deserved one more chance whenever life quietly offered it. Before leaving the restaurant, she poured herself the last cup of coffee from the pot that had been warming all afternoon. It was no longer fresh, but she smiled anyway. Some things were valuable because they stayed, not because they were perfect. Outside, the evening air carried the first hint of approaching winter. Claire slipped on her light coat and began the familiar walk home, passing neighbors who greeted her by name. For the first time in many years, she noticed something changing inside herself. She had always believed the safest kindness was the one that never became personal. Yet today she had stepped into a stranger's story and trusted that compassion would not be wasted. Ethan drove until dusk settled over the countryside. In the fading light, he noticed a weathered sign welcoming travelers to the county where he had grown up. He slowed the car almost instinctively. Beyond the next few miles waited a front porch, a kitchen that might still smell of apple pie, and a woman who had never stopped leaving room for him at the table. As his watch quietly marked another passing minute, Ethan found himself wondering whether forgiveness sometimes began long before the person asking for it ever found the courage to come home. By the time Ethan turned onto the narrow country road, the sky had faded into soft shades of blue and amber. The farmhouse appeared exactly where memory had left it, standing quietly beneath 2 old maple trees that had grown broader with every year he had stayed away. The white paint had weathered. The wooden porch leaned ever so slightly. Yet the small porch light glowed against the coming evening exactly as it had when he was a boy coming home after baseball practice. He parked without turning off the engine for several long moments. His hands rested on the steering wheel while the family letter and old photograph lay beside him on the passenger seat. The watch on his wrist marked another passing minute, but he no longer looked at it. Time had finally lost the argument. He stepped out of the car carrying nothing except the envelope. Gravel crunched softly beneath his shoes as he walked toward the front porch. Before he could knock, the front door opened. Margaret Brooks stood there wearing the same blue knitted cardigan she had worn in countless family photographs, though now it hung more loosely across her shoulders. Her silver hair framed a face touched by age but softened by unmistakable warmth. She looked at him for a long second without speaking. Then her eyes drifted to the envelope in his hand, and the smallest smile appeared. "You found the letter," she said gently. Ethan tried to answer, but the words refused to come. Instead, he nodded like the little boy from the faded photograph. Margaret stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him without hesitation. There was no speech about lost years, no list of missed birthdays, only the quiet embrace of a mother who had never stopped making room for her son. Ethan closed his eyes as he returned the hug. He realized he could not remember the last time anyone had held him without expecting something in return. Inside the house, almost nothing had changed. The old clock still ticked above the fireplace. Family photographs lined the hallway. A birthday cake stand rested on top of the kitchen cabinet even though it held no cake today. It reminded Ethan of every birthday his mother had celebrated whether he came or not. On the stove, a fresh apple pie cooled beside 2 waiting coffee cups. Margaret noticed him looking. "I always make one on Sundays," she said with a quiet laugh. "Old habits stay longer than people think." Ethan looked at the empty chair across the kitchen table. It was already set with a plate, a fork, and a folded napkin. She had expected no guest, yet she had always prepared enough for 2. His throat tightened as he carefully placed the old photograph beside the pie. Margaret picked it up with trembling fingers and smiled at the younger versions of them both. "You laughed so easily back then," she whispered. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I forgot how." Margaret reached across the table and rested her weathered hand over his. "No," she answered softly. "You only forgot where." Outside, the porch light continued shining into the quiet evening, while the coffee slowly filled the kitchen with familiar warmth. Ethan looked around the room that had waited for him without complaint, and one gentle question settled into his heart. How many people spend years searching for success, while never realizing that the place they truly long for has been patiently waiting with the light on all along? The pie tasted exactly as Ethan remembered. The crust was lightly crisp, the apples still carried a hint of cinnamon, and the filling was warm enough to fog the coffee cup sitting between him and his mother. He had eaten in restaurants that required reservations months in advance and had attended dinners where every detail had been flawless, yet nothing had ever felt as complete as this simple meal beneath the soft kitchen light. Margaret poured more coffee into his cup before filling her own. She smiled when she noticed that he had finally taken off his expensive watch and placed it beside the old photograph on the table. "You used to complain that watches made your wrist itch," she said with a quiet laugh. Ethan looked at the polished timepiece resting next to the faded picture of the 12-year-old boy who had once believed Sunday afternoons lasted forever. "Maybe they still do," he answered. "I just stopped listening." They shared a silence that no longer felt uncomfortable. Outside, the porch light continued glowing while a cool breeze stirred the maple leaves across the front yard. Inside, the old clock above the fireplace continued ticking, but its steady rhythm no longer sounded like something chasing him. It sounded like something welcoming him home. Margaret stood and disappeared into the hallway for a moment before returning with a small cardboard box. She placed it gently beside the birthday cake stand. "I kept a few things," she said. Ethan opened the box carefully. Inside rested old report cards, a baseball glove with cracked leather, a school drawing of the farmhouse, and dozens of birthday cards he had mailed during his college years before life had become too busy. At the very bottom lay every letter she had ever received from him, tied together with a faded blue ribbon. "You saved all of these?" he whispered. Margaret looked almost surprised by the question. A mother keeps proof that her child once needed her. Ethan could not answer. His fingers rested on the ribbon while his eyes filled with quiet gratitude rather than regret alone. Across town, Claire finished washing the last coffee cup before turning off the lights inside the restaurant. The small wooden box beneath the register remained where it always had, holding its collection of handwritten receipts, treasured notes, and tiny reminders that ordinary kindness often outlived extraordinary success. She slipped on her coat and prepared to leave when the owner called her name. "Claire," he said, handing her an envelope that had arrived by courier only minutes earlier. She recognized Ethan's name on the corner but did not open it. Instead, she placed it carefully inside her bag, deciding it could wait until morning. For years she had believed every unexpected envelope carried bad news. Tonight, for the first time, she allowed herself to believe it might carry gratitude instead. Back at the farmhouse, Ethan stood on the porch beside his mother before she quietly reached for his arm. They watched the stars begin to appear above the familiar roofline without feeling the need to fill the silence. He realized that some conversations did not begin with words. They began when two people simply chose not to leave. As the cool evening settled around them, Ethan found himself wondering whether the greatest gift Claire had given either of them was not the letter she delivered, but the quiet courage to believe that even after years apart, love could still recognize its way home. 3 months later, Sunday had quietly become sacred again. Ethan no longer measured his weekends by meetings postponed or flights delayed. He measured them by the sound of his mother's laughter drifting through the farmhouse kitchen, by the familiar aroma of apple pie cooling beside 2 coffee cups, and by the gentle rhythm of ordinary moments that had once seemed too small to matter. The old photograph now rested in a simple wooden frame on the kitchen shelf. Beside it sat the family letter, carefully folded inside a small glass box that Margaret insisted was not meant to protect the paper, but to remind them both that some words deserved to remain visible. Ethan smiled every time he saw it. The letter had once carried him home. Now it reminded him to stay. Back in Boston, Hawthorne Grill welcomed another busy afternoon. Claire tied on her apron exactly as she always had, greeting regular customers by name and remembering who preferred tea instead of coffee when the weather turned colder. The small wooden box beneath the register had gained one more treasure. Inside rested Ethan's handwritten note, folded beside the widow's receipt and the children's drawings she had quietly collected over the years. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that success means very little if no one is waiting to share it with you." Claire had read those words only once. She did not need to read them again. Some kindness settled into the heart after a single glance. Late that afternoon, the familiar bell above the restaurant door chimed. Claire looked up from pouring coffee and immediately recognized the navy jacket before she recognized the man wearing it. Ethan entered carrying a warm apple pie instead of a briefcase. His expensive watch was still on his wrist, but now it seemed to serve him instead of ruling him. Behind him walked Margaret in her blue cardigan, smiling at the restaurant as though she had returned to visit old friends. Claire stood quietly, almost surprised by the warmth she felt rising inside her. For so many years she had believed that helping strangers meant watching them disappear forever. Seeing them return changed something she had not realized still needed healing. Margaret stepped forward first and embraced Claire with both arms. "I wanted to thank the woman who brought my son back before I thanked anyone else," she whispered. Claire closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought of her own parents, of the faded photograph she kept in the wooden box, and of all the times she had convinced herself that caring too deeply only invited heartbreak. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps the safest heart was not the one that stayed closed, but the one willing to remain kind despite disappointment. They shared pie together near the same window where everything had begun. The coffee cups were warm. The conversations were unhurried. No one mentioned billion-dollar companies. No one spoke about missed years. They simply enjoyed an ordinary afternoon, and somehow it felt extraordinary. As the sun lowered across the Boston streets, Ethan noticed an elderly man leaving the restaurant wearing a familiar winter coat. Claire quietly handed him a small box containing a slice of pie to take home. She did it with the same gentle smile she offered everyone. Ethan finally understood that the greatest thing Claire had ever given him was not a message, a letter, or even another chance with his mother. She had quietly reminded him that dignity is measured by how we treat people when there is nothing to gain. And as the three of them sat together while the coffee slowly cooled and the old photograph caught the golden afternoon light, it became beautifully clear that visible power may earn applause for a season, but quiet kindness is what people remember for a lifetime.